The pre-dawn darkness of May 1st, 1898, hung over Manila Bay like a funeral shroud, broken only by the occasional glimmer of starlight on the water's surface. Commodore George Dewey stood on the bridge of his flagship, the USS Olympia, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he surveyed the sleeping Spanish fleet anchored at Cavite. The tension was palpable among his officers, their faces etched with the gravity of what lay ahead. This was no ordinary naval engagement. This was a moment that would reshape the balance of power in the Pacific and announce America's arrival. As a global naval force, the American Asiatic Squadron had sailed from Hong Kong just days earlier, carrying with it the weight of a nation's ambitions and the fury of a people. Outraged by the mysterious explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, Dewey's fleet consisted of 4 cruisers, the Olympia, Baltimore, Raleigh, and Boston, along with the gunboats Concord and Petrel, and the revenue cutter Hugh McCulloch. Though modest in number, these vessels represented the cutting edge of American naval technology, their steel hulls gleaming with fresh paint and their crews drilled to perfection. As the first hints of dawn began to creep across the horizon, Dewey's mind raced through the intelligence reports he had studied countless times. The Spanish fleet, commanded by Admiral Patricio Montoya y Pasaron, was anchored in a defensive line near the Cavite Naval Arsenal. Montoya had chosen his position carefully, hoping that the shallow waters would provide some protection and that the shore batteries would supplement his firepower. His fleet included the cruisers Reina, Cristina, Castilla, Don Antonio de Ulloa, Don Juan de Austria, Isla de Luzon, and Isla de Cuba. Along with several smaller gunboats, the Commodore's steward approached quietly, offering a cup of coffee that steamed in the cool morning air. Dewey accepted it with a nod, his piercing blue eyes never leaving the distant Spanish ships. He had spent his entire career preparing for moments like this, rising through the ranks during the Civil War and honing his skills in the decades that followed. Now, at 59 years old, he stood on the precipice of history. According to historical accounts documented in Harper's Weekly following the battle, Dewey had received his orders from Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt weeks earlier. In the event of war with Spain, your duty will be to see that the Spanish squadron does not leave the Asiatic station and that the Philippines are taken. The weight of these words had driven every decision since, from the careful positioning of his ships to the endless drills that had prepared his men for combat. The Spanish commander, Admiral Montoya, was himself a veteran of many campaigns, but he faced an impossible situation. His ships were older, less well-armed, and manned by crews that had not seen serious action in years. The Reina Cristina, his flagship, was a respectable vessel, but she and her companions were outgunned and outmaneuvered by the American fleet, that now approached through the pre-dawn gloom as the sun began its ascent. Casting long shadows across the bay, Dewey turned to his flag captain, Charles Gridley, and spoke the words that would echo through naval history. "You may fire when you are ready, Gridley." The die was cast, and the Battle of Manila Bay was about to begin. The morning sun of May 1st. 1898 had barely cleared the horizon when the first American guns opened fire, their thunderous roar shattering the tranquil silence. Of Manila Bay, Commodore Dewey's flagship, the USS Olympia, led the American column in a sweeping turn that brought all her guns to bear on the Spanish fleet. The sight was magnificent and terrifying. 6 American warships moving in perfect formation, their steel hulls cutting through the calm waters while smoke and flame erupted from their gun turrets. Admiral Montoya, aboard the Reina Cristina, watched in growing alarm as the American fleet approached. He had hoped that the shallow waters near Cavite would force the enemy ships to maintain a respectful distance. But Dewey's vessels drew closer with each passing minute, their superior speed and maneuverability allowing them to choose their range. The Spanish admiral knew his ships were outmatched, but honor and duty demanded that he fight with everything at his disposal. The USS Baltimore, under Captain Nehemiah Dyer, followed close behind the Olympia, her 8-inch guns already finding their mark among the Spanish vessels. The accuracy of American gunnery was immediately apparent shell after shell struck home, sending geysers of smoke and debris skyward from the enemy ships. The Spanish return fire was spirited but largely ineffective, their older guns unable to reach the American fleet with any consistency. Captain Frank Wilds, commanding the USS Boston, marveled at the precision of his gunners as they systematically dismantled the Spanish defenses. The crew had trained relentlessly for this moment, and their discipline showed in every perfectly coordinated salvo. Smoke began to pour from several Spanish vessels, and it became clear that the enemy was taking tremendous punishment. The Spanish gunboat Ulloa was among the first to suffer catastrophic damage. Her captain, Don Luis Cadarso, fought valiantly to keep his small vessel in action. But the overwhelming American firepower proved impossible to withstand. Shell after shell crashed into her hull, starting fires that soon raged out of control. Despite the hopeless situation, Cadarso refused to abandon his post, continuing to direct his guns until a direct hit ended his life and effectively destroyed his ship. Meanwhile, the USS Raleigh, under Captain Joseph Coghlan, had peeled away from the main battle line to engage the Spanish ships anchored closer to shore. Her rapid-fire guns created a devastating storm of steel that raked the enemy vessels from bow to stern. The Spanish crews fought bravely. They were facing weapons and tactics that represented the latest in naval warfare, while their own equipment belonged to an earlier era, as documented in contemporary reports from the New York Herald. The battle's intensity reached its peak when Admiral Montoyo attempted a desperate counterattack with his flagship. The Reina Cristina, her Spanish battle ensign, flying proudly, despite the carnage around her, made a gallant charge toward the American line. It was a move born of desperation and honor rather than tactical wisdom, but it demonstrated the courage that Spanish sailors had displayed for centuries on the world's oceans. The American response was swift and merciless. Every gun that could be brought to bear focused on the approaching Spanish flagship. The Reina Cristina staggered under the impact of multiple hits, her superstructure torn apart by the concentrated firepower of Dewey's fleet. Admiral Montoyo, wounded but still conscious, finally ordered his flagship to withdraw to avoid complete destruction. The USS Concord and Petrel, though smaller than their consorts, played crucial roles in the developing battle. These gunboats used their shallow draft to venture into waters too dangerous for the larger cruisers, systematically destroying Spanish vessels that had sought refuge near the shore. Their commanders showed remarkable initiative, pressing their attacks with a boldness that perfectly complemented Dewey's overall strategy. As the morning wore on, it became increasingly clear that the Spanish fleet was doomed. Ship after ship fell victim to American gunnery, and the waters of Manila Bay began to fill with the debris of a once proud naval force. The thunder of battle continued to roll across the bay, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. By mid-morning, on May 1st, 1898, the Spanish fleet lay in ruins beneath the tropical sun, but Commodore Dewey faced an unexpected crisis that threatened to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. A report from his ammunition officer sent shockwaves through the American flagship. The USS Olympia was dangerously low on 5-inch ammunition. The news spread quickly among the senior officers, creating a moment of anxiety that contrasted sharply with their earlier confidence. Dewey made a decision that would become legendary in naval annals. Rather than continue the bombardment and risk running completely out of ammunition, he ordered his fleet to withdraw to a safe distance for breakfast and a thorough assessment of their supplies. The audacity of stopping for a meal in the middle of a battle astonished both friend and foe, but it demonstrated the kind of cool-headed leadership that separated great commanders from merely competent ones. Captain Charles Gridley, Dewey's flag captain, used the respite to conduct a careful inventory of their remaining ammunition stores. What he discovered was both embarrassing and relieving. The earlier report had been incorrect. The Olympia had expended far less ammunition than initially calculated, and there were sufficient shells remaining to complete the destruction of the Spanish fleet. The error had been caused by confusion in the heat of battle, but it had led to one of the most famous breakfast breaks in military history. While the Americans reorganized and refreshed themselves, the Spanish fleet attempted to make repairs and prepare for what they knew would be their final stand. Admiral Montoyo, nursing wounds received when his flagship came under concentrated fire, surveyed the devastation around him with the stoic acceptance of a professional naval officer. The Reina Cristina was severely damaged and barely afloat, while several of his other vessels had been completely destroyed or were rapidly sinking. The Spanish shore batteries at Cavite had proven largely ineffective against the American fleet, their obsolete guns unable to reach the enemy vessels with any accuracy. The fort's commander, recognizing the futility of continued resistance, began preparing to spike his guns and destroy his ammunition stores rather than allow them to fall into American hands. It was a bitter decision, but one that reflected the harsh realities of their situation. Don Luis Cadurso's heroic death aboard the Aloha had become a rallying point for the remaining Spanish sailors, who prepared to fight to the end despite their hopeless position. These men, many of whom had families in Spain they would never see again, embodied the centuries-old traditions of Spanish naval honor. They would not surrender easily even in the face of overwhelming odds, as reported in dispatches later published. By the London Times, Dewey's tactical pause also allowed him to assess the broader strategic situation. The battle had unfolded exactly as he had hoped. His superior firepower and gunnery had systematically destroyed the enemy fleet while sustaining minimal casualties. Only one American sailor had been injured in the entire engagement, testament to both the effectiveness of American tactics and the obsolete nature of Spanish equipment. The Commodore also took time to consider his next moves. Destroying the Spanish fleet was only the beginning of his mission. He would need to secure Manila Bay and establish American control over the Philippines. This would require careful coordination with army forces that would arrive later, as well as diplomatic negotiations with Filipino insurgents who had been fighting Spanish rule for years. Captain Wilds of the Boston reported that his crew's morale was exceptionally high despite the morning's intense action. The men had performed magnificently under fire, and their confidence in their officers and equipment had been fully vindicated. Similar reports came from all the American vessels. Discipline had held firm. Gunnery had been accurate, and the machinery had functioned flawlessly throughout the engagement. The Spanish, meanwhile, used the lull to evacuate wounded sailors and make whatever repairs were possible to their battered vessels. They knew that when the Americans resumed their attack, it would likely mean the end of Spanish naval power in the Pacific. Yet they prepared to meet their fate with the dignity that had characterized their service throughout the morning's battle. As the American crews finished their meal and prepared to resume combat operations, Dewey stood once again on his bridge, surveying the scene before him. The tactical situation remained completely in his favor, but he was already thinking beyond the immediate battle to the larger implications of what was unfolding in Manila Bay. The tropical sun reached its zenith as Commodore Dewey's fleet resumed its devastating assault on the remnants of the Spanish squadron. The brief respite had allowed the Americans to reorganize their ammunition and assess their tactical situation, while the Spanish had used the time to brace themselves for what they knew would be their final stand. The waters of Manila Bay, already littered with debris from the morning's carnage, would soon witness the complete annihilation of centuries-old Spanish naval power in the Pacific. Admiral Montoyo, his flagship Reina Cristina listing heavily and wreathed in smoke, made the agonizing decision to transfer his flag to the Isla de Cuba. The change of command ship was executed under fire, a testament to Spanish seamanship even in desperate circumstances. As he looked back at his former flagship, now little more than a floating wreck, Montoyo understood that he was presiding over the end of an era. Spanish dominion over these waters, maintained since the days of Magellan, was about to come to a catastrophic conclusion. The USS Olympia led the renewed American attack, her guns speaking with renewed fury as they systematically dismantled what remained of Spanish resistance. Captain Gridley had distributed his ammunition carefully, ensuring that every shell would count in the final phase of the battle. The accuracy of American gunnery continued to be devastating. Trained crews working with superior equipment against targets that could barely maneuver or return effective fire. The Spanish gunboat, Don Juan de Austria, under the command of Captain Luis Hernandez Pinzon made a gallant but futile attempt to close with the American fleet. Her small size made her a difficult target, but also rendered her guns ineffective against the heavily armored American cruisers. Shell after shell crashed into her hull as she pressed her attack, until finally a direct hit to her boiler room ended her brave but doomed charge in a cloud of steam and smoke. Captain Nehemiah Dyer of the USS Baltimore positioned his ship to block any attempt by surviving Spanish vessels to escape toward the open sea. His 8-inch guns methodically pounded the remaining enemy ships, each salvo adding to the growing mountain of twisted metal and human suffering that had once been Admiral Montoya's proud squadron. The Spanish flag still flew from several vessels, but it was increasingly clear that this was mere defiance rather than effective resistance. The shore batteries at Cavite, which had proven largely ineffective throughout the battle, finally fell silent as their crews abandoned their posts. Of the guns were spiked to prevent their capture, while others were simply left to the advancing Americans. The fort's commander, recognizing that further resistance was pointless, ordered the destruction of the ammunition magazines to deny them to the enemy. According to contemporary accounts preserved in the archives of the War Department, the Spanish casualties began mounting rapidly during this final phase. The Castilla, one of the largest ships in Montoya's fleet, finally succumbed to the accumulated damage from hours of American bombardment. Her captain ordered the crew to abandon ship just moments before a massive explosion tore through her hull, sending her to the bottom of Manila Bay in a column of smoke and flame. The USS Raleigh and USS Concord worked in coordination to eliminate the smaller Spanish vessels that had sought shelter near the shore. These gunboats and dispatch vessels posed little threat to the American fleet, but Dewey was determined to achieve complete victory. No Spanish warship would remain afloat to challenge American control of these waters or potentially escape to fight another day. Captain Joseph Coghlan of the Raleigh observed with professional admiration the courage displayed by Spanish sailors even in their final moments. Despite facing overwhelming odds and obsolete equipment, they continued to serve their guns and maintain discipline aboard ships that were literally disintegrating around them. It was the kind of bravery that transcended national boundaries and earned the respect of professional warriors everywhere. The Isla de Cuba, now serving as Admiral Montoya's flagship, came under concentrated fire from multiple American vessels. The Spanish admiral, wounded and exhausted, finally accepted the inevitable. Rather than see more of his men die in a hopeless cause, he began preparing to surrender what remained of his fleet. The decision was perhaps the most difficult of his long naval career, but it was also the most humane. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the thunder of naval gunfire gradually diminished. The Battle of Manila Bay was drawing to its inevitable conclusion, and with it, Spain's centuries-long dominance in the Pacific was coming to an end. White flag of surrender finally appeared above the smoking remnants of the Spanish fleet as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Manila Bay. Admiral Patricio Montoya y Pasaron, his uniform stained with blood and his face etched with the pain of defeat, made the most difficult decision of his naval career. From the bridge of the Isla de Cuba, now his third flagship of the day, he ordered the cessation of Spanish resistance. The Battle of Manila Bay was over. American naval supremacy in the Pacific had been established in a single, devastating engagement. Commodore Dewey received the surrender with the dignity befitting a professional naval officer. Despite the completeness of his victory, he showed respect for his defeated opponent and concern for the Spanish wounded. Medical assistance was immediately offered to enemy casualties. Arrangements were made for the proper treatment of prisoners. This magnanimity and victory would become part of the legend surrounding the battle, demonstrating that American naval power would be exercised with honor and humanity. The human cost of the battle told the story of its one-sided nature more eloquently than any tactical analysis. Spanish casualties numbered in the hundreds of. Marno Yo himself was wounded. Captain Don Luis Cadarso of the Ulloa was among the dead, and dozens of sailors had perished aboard ships that were now settling into the mud of Manila Bay. In stark contrast, American losses were almost negligible. Only 8 men had been wounded across the entire fleet, and not a single American sailor had lost his life. It was a disparity that spoke volumes about the technological and tactical superiority of Dewey's force. The material destruction was equally dramatic. Of the Spanish fleet that had greeted the dawn, virtually nothing remained combat effective. The Reina Cristina was a burned-out hulk. The Castilla had been completely destroyed, and the smaller vessels had been systematically eliminated by American gunfire. The shore batteries at Cavite were silent, their guns spiked or abandoned. Spanish naval power in the Pacific, built up over 3 centuries of colonial expansion, had been annihilated in a single morning's work. Captain Charles Gridley supervised the initial occupation of the Cavite naval arsenal, finding extensive stores of ammunition and supplies that would prove valuable for future American operations. The Spanish had been caught completely off guard by the speed and effectiveness of the American attack, leaving behind intelligence materials that would prove invaluable in understanding Spanish defensive positions throughout the Philippines. The capture of these facilities gave Dewey a secure base of operations for the campaigns that would follow. The news of victory spread rapidly throughout the American fleet, creating scenes of jubilation that contrasted sharply with the somber business of caring for Spanish wounded and securing prisoners. Sailors who had spent months preparing for this moment finally allowed themselves to celebrate. Though their officers maintained the discipline that had made victory possible, the Stars and Stripes was raised over Cavite, marking the beginning of American administration in the Philippines, as documented in reports. It's later published in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. The international implications of Dewey's victory were immediately apparent to observers around the world. European naval experts, many of whom had dismissed American naval capabilities, were forced to reassess their understanding of the new balance of power in the Pacific. Germany, which had significant interests in the region, began moving additional naval forces to Philippine waters. Great Britain, America's traditional rival, found itself reconsidering the implications of emerging American naval strength. Dewey's tactical conduct of the battle would become a subject of study in naval academies around the world. His decision, too close to effective range despite the presence of Spanish shore batteries, demonstrated a level of aggressive confidence that marked the arrival of a new naval power. The superior American gunnery, combined with more modern ships and better-trained crews, had created a victory so complete that it bordered on the miraculous. The Filipino insurgents, who had been fighting Spanish colonial rule for years, watched the battle's outcome with mixed emotions. While they welcomed the end of Spanish dominance, they understood that American occupation might present new challenges to their dreams of independence. Emilio Aguinaldo and other insurgent leaders would soon find themselves negotiating with their new American neighbors, beginning a complex relationship that would shape Philippine history for decades to come. Admiral Montojo, despite his defeat, conducted himself with the dignity expected of a Spanish naval officer. His post-battle report to Madrid would be a masterpiece of professional analysis, acknowledging American superiority while defending the courage of his men. He understood that his career was over, but he had fought honorably against overwhelming odds. As evening fell over Manila Bay, Commodore Dewey stood on the bridge of his flagship, surveying a scene that would be remembered as one of the most decisive naval victories in history. The smoking wrecks scattered across the bay bore silent testimony to the emergence of American naval power and the dawn of a new era in Pacific politics. The golden light of late afternoon on May 1st, 1898, illuminated a transformed Manila Bay as Commodore George Dewey stood aboard his flagship, now the master of waters that had been Spanish for over 300 years. The smoking hulks of Admiral Montoyo's fleet dotted the bay like tombstones, marking the end of an empire. While the American flag flew proudly over the captured facilities at Cavite, in a single morning's work, the United States Navy had announced its arrival as a Pacific power and fundamentally altered the balance of global naval strength. The immediate aftermath of victory brought both celebration and sobering responsibility. Dewey's officers moved efficiently to secure their prizes, establish communications with the shore, and begin the complex process of administering conquered territory. Captain Frank Wilds of the USS Boston supervised the occupation of Spanish shore installations, finding them better equipped than expected but completely demoralized by the morning's catastrophic defeat. Spanish colonial officials, cut off from their fleet and facing an uncertain future, began tentative negotiations for the peaceful transfer of authority. The wounded Admiral Montoyo, his pride as damaged as his body, was treated with the courtesy due a defeated but honorable opponent. Dewey's personal physician attended to the Spanish commander's injuries while arrangements were made for the care of other Spanish casualties. This display of magnanimity reflected not only Dewey's character, but also America's desire to present itself as a civilized naval power worthy of respect from European observers who would scrutinize every aspect of the victory. Intelligence gathered from captured Spanish documents revealed the extent of colonial defensive preparations throughout the Philippines. Maps, troop dispositions, and supply inventories provided Dewey with invaluable information for future operations. The Spanish had clearly been caught off guard by the speed and decisiveness of American action, leaving behind materials that would prove crucial in the campaigns to come. Captain Charles Gridley organized this intelligence windfall with the methodical efficiency that had characterized American preparations throughout the engagement. The Filipino population of Manila watched the day's events with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Many had suffered under Spanish colonial rule and welcomed any change that might bring independence, but they understood little about American intentions or capabilities. Emilio Aguinaldo, the insurgent leader, was still in exile, but would soon return to find his country occupied by a new foreign power with its own agenda for the Philippines. European reaction to the battle's outcome was swift and revealing. German naval units in the area began concentrating near Manila Bay, ostensibly to protect German commercial interests, but clearly intended to monitor American intentions. British observers, despite their nation's historical rivalry with the United States, found themselves grudgingly impressed by the professional competence displayed by Dewey's fleet. French and Russian naval attaches began filing reports that would influence their government's policies toward the emerging American presence in the Pacific. According to contemporary dispatches preserved in the congressional record, President William McKinley received news of the victory with satisfaction, but also with awareness of its broader implications. The complete destruction of Spanish naval power in the Pacific meant that the United States would need to assume responsibility for governing territories it had never intended to acquire permanently. The battle that had begun as a strategic move in the Spanish-American War is evolving into something far more significant. Dewey himself seemed to understand the historical magnitude of what had been accomplished. His official dispatches to Washington were models of professional understatement. But private letters to his family revealed his awareness that he had participated in a moment that would reshape American foreign policy. The quiet naval officer who had followed orders to neutralize Spanish naval power had instead delivered an entire empire into American hands. The technological implications of the battle were immediately apparent to naval experts worldwide. Devastating effectiveness of American gunnery, achieved through superior training and more modern fire control systems, demonstrated the direction of naval warfare's evolution. European navies began reassessing their own capabilities and training programs in light of what American crews had accomplished against a traditional naval power. As night fell over Manila Bay, signal lights blinked between American vessels as they established the communication networks necessary for extended occupation duties. The USS Olympia's wireless operators worked to establish contact with American forces in other theaters of the UHT, Spanish-American War, transmitting news of victory that would electrify the American public and concern European chancelleries. A Spanish flag that had flown over Manila Bay for centuries had been hauled down, placed by American colors that would fly there for the next 46 years. Admiral Montoya's proud fleet lay broken and scattered across the bay's bottom, victim to a new style of naval warfare that emphasized technological superiority and aggressive tactics over traditional concepts of honor and glory. Commodore Dewey, soon to become Admiral Dewey in recognition of his achievement, had achieved something more significant than a mere tactical victory. He had announced America's emergence as a global naval power and set in motion events that would define the Pacific region for generations to come. Part 7. Legacy of Thunder, the dawn of May 2nd. 1898 broke over a Manila Bay forever changed, where the wreckage of Spanish naval power lay scattered beneath waters that now reflected the stars and stripes. Commodore George Dewey, standing on the quarterdeck of his flagship USS Olympia, understood that the previous day's battle had accomplished far more than the destruction of an enemy fleet. In 7 hours of methodical naval combat, the United States had announced its arrival as a Pacific power and fundamentally altered the trajectory of world history. The human drama of victory and defeat continued to unfold in the battle's immediate aftermath. Spanish survivors, pulled from the wreckage of their ships by American sailors, were treated with a dignity that reflected credit on both navies. Admiral Patricio Montoya y Pasaron, his career ended but his honor intact, conducted himself with the stoic professionalism that had characterized Spanish naval service for centuries. His post-battle reports to Madrid would acknowledge American superiority while defending the courage of men who had fought impossible odds with obsolete equipment. News of the victory began its journey around the world, carried by cable and dispatched to capitals where its implications would be debated for years to come. In Washington, President William McKinley found himself confronting responsibilities he had never anticipated when he authorized military action against Spain. The complete destruction of Spanish Pacific naval power meant that the United States would inherit an empire stretching from the Caribbean to the South China Sea, fundamentally altering America's role in global affairs. The technological lessons of Manila Bay resonated through naval establishments worldwide. The devastating effectiveness of American gunnery, achieved through superior training and more modern fire control systems, forced European powers to reassess their own naval capabilities. British Admiralty reports noted that American crews had achieved hit rates that exceeded anything seen in recent European naval exercises. German naval observers, initially dismissive of American capabilities, began filing reports that would influence Kaiser Wilhelm's naval construction programs for the next decade. Captain Charles Gridley supervised the establishment of American administration over captured Spanish facilities, finding resources that would support extended operations throughout the Philippine archipelago. The intelligence windfall from captured Spanish documents provided detailed information about colonial defenses, troop dispositions, and supply lines that would prove invaluable in campaigns yet to come. Dewey's tactical victory was already evolving into strategic dominance over an entire region. The Filipino people who had observed the battle from the shores of Manila Bay understood that their struggle for independence had entered a new phase. Spanish colonial rule, oppressive but familiar, was ending. American occupation, benevolent but foreign, was beginning. Emilio Aguinaldo and other insurgent leaders would soon discover that their new neighbors had their own vision for the Philippines' future, one that might not align with Filipino dreams of immediate independence. According to contemporary reports published in Harper's Weekly, following extensive interviews with battle participants, the professional competence displayed by American naval personnel impressed even their enemies. Spanish officers, despite their defeat, acknowledged that they had faced crews trained to a standard that exceeded anything in their own experience. This recognition would influence Spanish naval reforms in the years following the disaster at Manila Bay. The international ramifications of Dewey's victory extended far beyond the Philippines. European colonial powers, comfortable with the traditional balance of Pacific influence, suddenly faced an aggressive new competitor with modern naval capabilities and apparent territorial ambitions. Germany began moving additional naval units to the region, while Britain reconsidered its Pacific strategy in light of emerging American strength. The old order, dominated by European colonial powers, was giving way to a new era in which the United States would play an increasingly important role. Dewey himself, promoted to admiral in recognition of his achievement, became an overnight celebrity in America and a subject of intense study in European naval circles. His tactical conduct of the battle would be analyzed in military academies for generations, while his personal character would inspire American naval officers who sought to emulate his combination of professional competence and personal dignity. The quiet Commodore, who had faithfully executed orders to neutralize Spanish naval power, had become a symbol of American military capability. The wreckage littering Manila Bay served as a monument to the battle's significance. But the true legacy lay in what had been set in motion. American occupation of the Philippines would last nearly half a century, fundamentally shaping both nations. The naval supremacy established on May 1st, 1898, would influence Pacific politics through to world wars and into the modern era. As Admiral Dewey prepared his fleet for the extended occupation duties that lay ahead, he could not have foreseen all the consequences of his victory. The Battle of Manila Bay had begun as a tactical engagement in a limited war against Spain. It had evolved into something far more significant the moment when America stepped onto the world stage as a global naval power, ready to shape the destiny of nations and the course of history itself.